Welcome. My name is Natasha Sherman, and I am your host. And my guest today is Mark Crawford, State Director of SNAP. Welcome.
Hello, thank you, Natasha.
So I suspect most people don't know what SNAP is, so maybe you can explain that to us.
Sure. SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, is a national organization, a collection of individuals, supporters, family members, of those who have been abused by members of the clergy. Now, just because priest is in our name doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who participates is only abused by priests. Brothers, sisters, rabbis, ministers, it doesn't matter. All forms of clergy. So we're about at least 11,000 members nationally, and now we're beginning a very active presence in Europe, with certainly earlier this year.
Wow, you know, first of all, just the fact that we need an organization like that is a little overwhelming to think about. And you say 11,000 members, yes. And I suspect that's just a beginning. Sure. And so when was this organization started, and what is the focal point?
Sure. Well, I want to say in the early 80s, maybe... I'm sorry, let me start that over. Wow, I should have looked up the date SNAP actually started. I want to say, was it the late 80s or 90s?
So somewhere in the 80s
right.
or 90s.
Right. The early 90s survivor, Barbara Blaine from the Chicago area, had been abused by a priest. And when she came forward, she was met with the same resistance and issues that many survivors who have come forward and tried to, find their abuser and, alert the church, thinking that, they would get a pastoral response.
Yes, like you tell the people who care, and they'll take care of you, yes?
Exactly. But what she found, and many after her, and I'm sure many before, was that the institutional church, put up all these walls, became very defensive, and really didn't want to do anything to help, really bring forth the issue,
right?
Publicly.
Yes. So
out of frustration, she began this organization, and it has grown rapidly. And of course, in 2001, 2002, in Boston with Cardinal Law and the revelations and the exposure of all the priests who had been recycled, and how they had known well before that these members of the clergy had been abusing child after child. And instead of doing the right thing and putting the child's interest at first, their first reaction was to protect the institution. When survivors would come forward, requiring secrecy, not allowing them to speak or talk about, telling them not to talk about.
So the victims are re-victimized.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's certainly what happens, re-victimization. And
so, yes.
I just wanted to say, Natasha, silence, the sexual abuse, even physical abuse, you can get beyond that. But it's the emotional torment and the control that's often exhibited by the predator that does the long-term damage. And silence, a well-known therapist had said this, and I think it's excellent. Silence is the glue that keeps the sexual abuse of children firmly in place. So for many years, those victims remain silent with shame and guilt. And if ever, it takes many years before they come forward, if ever. And, to ask again for someone to keep what they've had, bottled up all these years hidden, is absolutely another victimization, without a doubt.
So I want to talk a little bit about you, because I saw you in a documentary, and the name of the documentary was?
Boys and Men Healing.
Okay. And you were part of that documentary because you were sexually abused by a priest.
That's correct.
So, and in that documentary, which I saw, the thing that was so unfathomable is that there are a couple of things. One is that, again, you're made to keep quiet.
Yes.
And it's your, and boys particularly are not the population that has been addressed in the area of sexual abuse. So it's much harder to even recognize and put a name to it. And then when you named your accuser, he ended up being promoted.
Yes, yes. Well, first of all, for boys and or men, we're not supposed to be victims. Our society doesn't accept that. If you look in the media or how it's portrayed in films, if there's a sexual encounter with somebody who's very young, that's, attaboy, but not so. It has devastating consequences and does lifelong harm. And it results in many, many issues, from addictions to mental health disorders, depression, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and we see this constantly in survivors. It's very
It destroys lives, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
So your abuser was your parish priest?
Yes. As a young boy, and there's always a grooming process, and these individuals.
Tell us about that.
Well, let's face it. Before they often have access to the individual, this is not somebody who's strange. This is somebody who represents a moral authority. Clergy abuse is sort of the equivalent of incest. Just as if a parent had abused you, because from a child's perspective, you look up to that person, and everything they tell you is supposed to be true.
And your parents have handed you over to him.
Exactly, and often very unwittingly, unknowingly, of course. Yeah. And that causes a bunch of difficult family dynamics within the household. But yes, oftentimes parents unwittingly put their children in a position of believing the priest, believing that they're looking to do the best or advance their own child's, growth. And, so of course they don't suspect this, they don't know. And children will not come forward. I don't care what you think, what you tell your children, children do not think like adults do.
I really want to stay on this because I think it's pivotal. Because very often when you hear these stories, even like someone who was kidnapped and, years later had the opportunity to escape but didn't, and
yes.
I hear people say, well, why didn't you leave? And I think it's what you're talking about.
Absolutely. I can give you an example from my own life. There were a number of reasons or things in which kept me silent, okay? But first, you have to remember that predator, whether it's a clergy person, a coach, a doctor, there's a connection, there's a need that they're filling for that child. Maybe the child is really, maybe he comes from a broken family, maybe not, but oftentimes they're looking for that affection, that trust, that acknowledgement that predator is giving. Okay, so that's number one. It makes them feel good. It's something they need. There's often monetary or material gifts involved. The predator or priest will start to shower the child with all kinds of things, bicycles, watches, cars, and you name it.
And makes you special.
Absolutely made me special, and that posed an additional issue, which I will address. But I remember him taking me shopping as I was probably 14 or 15 years old. I had the best clothes money could buy, Givenchy suit, expensive shoes, a watch. He took me on trips all over the country, even to Europe. I had things most other kids couldn't dream about at that age. And, it did make me feel special at first. And, in fact, it even helped keep me isolated because others sort of resented the relationship.
Right.
This real exclusive, oh, he's father's buddy, we know that, and he really looks after him and takes care of him. So whereas adults might think, that is great, the kids really kind of resented that sort of treatment.
So you're even more isolated.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, in my case, it went a bit further. He truly, and not uncommon in clergy abuse cases, for example, after instances where he had molested me, and I often, almost always, he would want to talk to me for long periods of time until I apologized.
Until you apologized.
Until I apologized.
And
in fact...
And what were you apologizing for?
Well, well, not directly the sexual abuse, but I began to withdraw and try to avoid him and stay away from him, and he sensed that. So as time went on, he wanted that reassurance that he felt was starting to drift away. So he needed that, and he constantly asked for it, and it really weighed heavily upon me. Another avenue in which he used to really keep me quiet was the fact that he constantly told me that he could not go on living without me. That life was not, it could not be the same, could not exist without me. And I always felt that he was telling me he would just kill himself if I was not part of his life, or possibly hurt me. There were times I absolutely believed he would kill me. I was terrified for my life. There were times he was very physically abusive, and I can remember several occasions where he really hit me because I wouldn't sleep in the same bed with him on a trip to Europe. Walking him home to the rectory one night, he asked how I saw him in his life, and he asked this very often. And I said, you know what? And I was afraid to say it, but I said, I'm going to put it out there. And I said, well, I sort of feel more like your wife. And he hit me so hard, he knocked me through a row of hedges, you know? So you learn not to go there, you know? He was extremely controlling.
Did you actually have to make your confessions to him?
I did not have to, but he was my mentor. And I was aspiring to become a priest at that young age. It was something I had wanted. I always thought about being a priest. And growing up in a religious, devout Catholic family, attended Mass daily, was an altar server. He even put me in charge of the altar boys. I would create their scheduling and train the new altar boys. And I was very proud of that. But you know, it was good for me to be at church because it was the one place I felt safe, where he wouldn't touch me. So it was my refuge. And to this day, I still find comfort, you know, in a church. But I will tell you these days, it is far more difficult for me to walk in and sit and listen during maybe a general Mass at Sunday. I can't do it. And hear things said, you know, that minimize those who have been abused. It robs my inner peace, and it hurts. And to see those that represent the truth and moral authority. Yes. And I'm not saying they're all guilty of this, but
the silence makes them guilty.
Yes,
you know,
absolutely.
And really,
they're not doing enough
to
challenge their own from within. That has to happen. And until the priests, the good priests who really understand this and know this, the few that there are, they need to really stand up and be counted, raise their voice.
You know, when you describe your story, and I have a couple of questions more to ask you about that, because I think it's so important for people out there to hear who may have had the experience or who haven't stepped up or who feel terribly isolated. But when you describe that, it sounds to me like being a prisoner of war.
It's funny you should say that, Natasha. I remember for quite a while, each night before going to sleep, I would pray that I could switch places with the hostages in Iran that were held captive for 400 some odd days. I remember thinking how much better my life would be if I could only switch places with them.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, the night that I saw you, and there was somebody in the audience that said something to the effect of, a society can't call themselves a civilized society if they don't protect their children. And, you know, it's not this only happens in the church, but they are the largest organized group right now where it's coming out. But if we can't protect our children, who are we?
Exactly.
When he said, who am I for you? Who are we for our children?
Exactly. And they have to understand that children cannot be fodder for some greater good. We cannot, in the name of all the other good the church may do, any church,
Yes.
turn around and then look the other way when we know a child has been harmed.
Yeah.
What does that say? That institution is not what is good or right. And we have to get beyond it. I'm not naive or ignorant. We know this will always happen. And we know there will be those who are less perfect and struggle and fail. But that said, it's not those who are committing this act that are the biggest problem. It's those who know of it and do
Yes.
nothing.
Yes. Yes. And, you know, I want to get back to, again, you know, just what, inside of your story, what people can see for themselves.
Yes.
So I heard you say, the night that I heard you speak, that if somebody had said to you, were you sexually abused, you would have said
No.
no.
I would have said no
So
for quite a while.
how is it that you wired it up? And I suspect that you blamed yourself. Yes?
Without a doubt. As almost any victim I've met, you live for years with, number one, believing you're the only one.
Right.
You really feel a lot of isolation, and that you cannot share this or talk to anybody, because everybody would think there's something wrong with you.
Yes. And it was your fault.
Absolutely. I mean,
And you didn't step up.
didn't step up. Even initially, how does it sound that my first sexual encounters were with another man? You know, will people
Right.
think I'm gay?
Right.
And you absolutely experience a time of sexual confusion. It's
I can
difficult.
imagine.
And you do not understand what's going on.
Because as was said, men's bodies will respond. So then, of course, you immediately feel, well, of course I must be an active participant in this.
When I was first molested, the very first time he touched me was on an overnight train ride from Chicago to Colorado. And I had awoken, a 13-year-old child, with an erection, and he was touching me. And he said, I was startled and didn't know what to think. I was horrified, confused, because I thought the world of this man. I really did. And at that point was thrilled about the vacation we were about to go on. He was taking away for several weeks, almost a month, up to the mountains in Colorado. That's where we were headed. He had planned this for over a year in advance. And he began to explain that this is what happens when people love each other, that there's a physical response. And he said it's very natural that that happens between two boys, or a male and another boy, because if that weren't the case, there'd be a lot more pregnant girls running around. That's what he had said to me. And, you know, I just was very...
As a 13-year-old, you know, again, and I think one of the key things that you said is, as a child, even as a teen, you do not think like adults think.
No.
You do not see a way out.
No,
And-
I did not.
And even if you have a supportive family, you do not go to them and say this terrible thing.
My mother was very religious, devoutly Catholic, and did anything for the priests in the parish, not just him, any of them. If she had to, she'd walk on, you know, fire. My dad was very active within the church, always assisting, but he became ill and was not well, and was definitely a challenge. It was difficult. I certainly wasn't about to tell anybody. And
Yes.
as time went on, and he spent more and more time and became more controlling and possessive, and I began to withdraw, his anger, his rage, his control grew. And my situation just spiraled. And the emotional torment was so difficult, so difficult.
I can't even imagine.
And
It spans years.
oh yes, well, it still comes up for me. It still can be triggered. News, you know, events, major things can bring it about. But at least now I can recognize it. I know how to deal with it. I can put it where it belongs in my life. But for years, and you had asked earlier, how is it that you go for years before dealing with it? What brings you to that point? And I will tell you, I think we consciously put it so far back in your mind. that you just don't deal with it. It's just not there. And that's a good thing. I think that's our body protecting
survival,
us.
yeah,
Right. It's a
mechanism.
survival mechanism because it's just too much for you to cope with at that point. And then I think there's times or occasions or triggers when you're at a point in your life that there's a different level of safety. For example, by the time for me this erupted into my consciousness, I was already married, had one child already, and what at that time was a good, strong, healthy relationship. And we had moved away from the town in which this had occurred. So there was definitely a distance from all of that. And I think that somehow played a role in allowing it to bubble up in my mind. But what directly affected the revelation was my younger brother, who was also abused by this man after me. I was home, and he began to act a bit erratic, and it just wasn't himself, and I knew something was really wrong. And he was talking about his abuse. And although I always suspected, I never really knew for certain that he did the same with him. I know after I had moved on and left for college, he began abusing my younger brother. And, or I suspected, I didn't know for certain. And sure enough, that is exactly what happened. He did the same things to him as he had done to me.
And your brother was erupting earlier than you did.
Oh,
or
yes.
he didn't have that survival mechanism that let him put it
Right,
in the
he
background.
could not, right. It was much more difficult for him, the effects far more devastating, and has really destroyed his life. And in a sense, I feel like I have to speak for him. I'm out there being the voice he can never be. And I know there's so many others.
I think you're the voice for many others. And what I think is so powerful about what you're doing is specifically that, giving voice so that people can uncover their own voice.
This is difficult for me. It's never easy, never enjoyable. But I know that if I really want to see this change, it is the only way it's going to come about, is by educating people as to what sexual abuse really is, about how clergy abuse really gets in. The trusted, loved members of our community, when most of the church will stand there and look at the victim and say, no, it can't be true. It can't be. I don't believe it. This priest is too good. How do you think they're able to ingratiate themselves into the lives of those families? It is because they are so, their
adept
personalities, yes, they're very skilled.
And as you said, there is kind of this grooming process, and it sounds to me like they're not only involved with you, but your family and your extended community. I guess the thing that for me, you know, on the one hand, I didn't grow up Catholic, but you said that, you know, the church was like a part of your everyday life. It was the mystery of the church, and these were the revered representers. And so there's some huge kind of mystical belief system around it. And I suspect that perhaps for the adults that still exists. Otherwise, why would they say to the children, you must be imagining it?
It didn't happen. There's so many times that happens. And for parents, you have to remember, there's an assault on their own person and a number of fronts. One, as a parent, it's your sole role to protect your child. What parent wants to find out that somehow they allowed their child to be sexually molested right under their nose? So you have that dynamic. You have, oh my God, this institution, this priest, this faith that I have put everything into. Somehow, is it not true? How could it have harmed me or my family in such an enormous way? So it's very common for the initial response of the parent to be, hold on here. You know, you had to play a role in this, or
you imagined it,
right? It didn't happen. This isn't true. Not as you said. Something else is wrong here. And you know what? It's not just parents. The community at large goes into denial. We see it very easily. Anybody who've seen recently Bishop Eddie Long and the Baptist Missionary Church out of Atlanta, and the 4 young men who have come forward now saying that they too were groomed and then had a sexual relationship with him. And this is not about men.
And he came out and said, I'm not perfect, and the congregation supported him.
Absolutely, absolutely, and thunderous applause. And he talked about being the David against Goliath. This bishop of a megachurch, one of the most revered or preeminent churches in our country, in the South, in Atlanta, 25,000 members.
What is wrong with us?
Look.
I don't understand. I don't understand. How can somebody say, he sexually abused me? He stands up and says, doesn't deny it or acknowledge it, but says, I'm not a perfect man. I'm just fighting a David and Goliath battle.
Right.
And people applaud. I don't get it.
Oftentimes we hear about false allegations by some of these people who have come forward. Oh, it's a false allegation, could be false. Certainly that always exists as a possibility, and without a doubt, on occasion that could happen. But let me point out, the bishops of the United States commissioned a study by John Jay College. And their own study, based on data supplied to them by the bishops, by the way, okay, had found that less than 1% were false allegations. Less than 1%. Okay? So chances are, when a child comes forward, an adult who says, I was molested as a child, 99% of the time, they're not lying. And the fact is, look, if this were just about trying to make a quick buck, I would think there's many easier ways than trying to say, you know, I was molested by another man.
Right, yes.
Especially for men in America. It's just, it's not going to happen. And it's a real red herring when we start to throw around, oh, well, a lot of these allegations are false and not true. Absolutely not the case.
Yeah. We have 1 minute left, and then we'll continue. But I think that one of the things that is so significant is that the impact on the abused people is life-shattering, and particularly now it has been for men because they've been kind of forced to hide it.
Yes.
And I think that the opening up of the subject is miraculous.
It certainly is, and we do have to thank the media for helping bring this to the surface. Without a doubt, I know many times they're vilified for the stories they're portraying. To me, they're a godsend, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, each and every one of us is touched by this, whether you want to admit it or not, whether you want to realize it or not. 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys will be the victim of unwanted sexual contact by the age of 18. That's staggering. That's beyond epidemic proportions had it been a virus or flu or a disease in our country.
1 in 4 and 1 in 6, yeah.
1 in 4, 1 in 6. Yet, how many never come forward? And the people, when we look around in our everyday, daily lives, how many of them have been touched by this? Or survivors of sexual abuse, and we don't even know it.
Or someone in their...
without a doubt.
In their realm.
Somebody in there extended, without a doubt.
So we're going to complete this portion and then continue the next half hour to talk more about what's happening in the legal world. But I want to thank you for being willing under extremely difficult circumstances. It takes tremendous courage, but more than that, a huge commitment to do what you do. So I want to thank you.
Natasha, thank you for the opportunity. The truth has to be told.
Yes.
And I'm here to help. I'm just that tool.
My name is Natasha Sherman. Thank you for joining us.